The most dangerous secrets are never spoken aloud. They're felt. The silver chandelier above the throne room scattered fractured light across the polished black floor, but Alpha King Lucian Blackwood barely noticed it. Seated upon the obsidian throne that overlooked the grand hall of Blackthorne Palace, he remained perfectly still while nobles, advisors, and visiting alphas discussed trade routes, winter preparations, and territorial agreements. To anyone watching, he appeared as he always did, calm, composed, untouchable. Yet beneath that flawless control, something was wrong. His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against the carved armrest of the throne. A scent drifted through the room. Soft, familiar, impossible to ignore. It reached him like the first hint of rain before a storm, subtle enough that no one else seemed to notice. Lucian's jaw hardened. For years, he had mastered every instinct that came with being Alpha King. He controlled his emotions, his reactions, even the restless wolf that lived beneath his skin. But now, as the scent lingered in the air, his focus fractured. Somewhere near the back of the hall, a young woman moved between rows of officials carrying a stack of documents pressed against her chest. Evelyn Hart never attracted attention. That was one of the reasons she had lasted so long within the palace walls. She dressed simply, spoke only when necessary, and seemed determined to make herself invisible in a place filled with power-hungry wolves. Yet tonight, Lucian's gaze found her instantly. Her pale blonde hair was gathered neatly at the nape of her neck. A few loose strands framed her face as she crossed the room. She never looked toward the throne. She never lingered. She always delivered her work and disappeared. But something had changed. The scent surrounding her was different. Warmer somehow. Richer. Lucian felt his pulse shift. Not faster. Sharper. More aware. The council continued speaking, voices blending into meaningless noise as his attention remained fixed on the woman moving through the crowd. Evelyn stopped beside an advisor, handed him a folder, and offered a polite smile. Then she lowered her eyes and stepped away. Simple. Ordinary. Yet the strange pull remained. Lucian inhaled once, slowly. His wolf stirred. Not aggressively. Not possessively. Curiously. As if recognizing something his conscious mind could not yet understand. Across the room, Evelyn froze for half a second. Her hand tightened around the remaining papers she carried. She didn't know why. She only knew the sensation that had followed her all week returned again. The feeling of being watched. Not by the court. Not by gossiping nobles. By him. She resisted the urge to glance toward the throne. Looking would only make things worse. Looking always made things worse. Lucian rose to his feet. Instantly, the room fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned toward him. The Alpha King rarely interrupted council meetings. Yet now he stood motionless, silver eyes fixed somewhere beyond the crowd. Evelyn felt the silence before she understood its cause. Slowly, against every instinct telling her not to, she lifted her gaze. For one impossible moment, her eyes met his across nearly 40 feet of polished stone. The entire hall seemed to disappear. Then Lucian looked away first. A small movement, barely noticeable, but it left a strange tension hanging in the air. Evelyn lowered her eyes immediately and hurried toward the exit, unaware that the scent lingering behind her remained etched in the Alpha King's mind long after she disappeared beyond the palace doors. And for the first time in years, Lucian Blackwood found himself unable to focus on anything else. Evelyn Hart spent the next morning convincing herself that nothing unusual had happened. The palace was enormous, filled with hundreds of people moving through endless corridors, offices, libraries, and meeting chambers. There was no reason the Alpha King would notice someone like her. No reason at all. Yet the memory of his silver eyes finding hers across the throne room followed her from sunrise until noon. She tried focusing on work. Stacks of correspondence waited on her desk inside the Royal Records Office. Trade agreements from Western territories. Supply reports from northern settlements. Invitations from neighboring pacts seeking audiences with the crown. Normally, organizing documents soothed her. Numbers stayed where they belonged. Paper never judged. Ink never demanded anything from her. Today, however, every time she reached for a file, her thoughts drifted somewhere they should not. She finally sighed and pushed away from the desk. The office window overlooked the palace gardens nearly 60 feet below. Early spring sunlight spilled across winding stone paths lined with white roses. Servants crossed the grounds carrying baskets of fresh flowers while guards maintained their quiet patrols. Everything appeared peaceful, predictable, safe. Evelyn wrapped her fingers around a warm mug of tea and stared outside. The problem was not the Alpha King. At least, that was what she kept telling herself. The problem was her imagination. It had always been too active for her own good. Ever since childhood, stories had lived inside her mind. While others dreamed of titles, wealth, or influence, Evelyn dreamed of conversations that never happened and characters who only existed on paper. Stories were easier than real life. Stories could stay hidden. She glanced toward the bottom drawer of her desk. Locked safely inside was a leather-bound notebook. The key rested on a chain beneath her blouse. Nobody knew about the notebook. Nobody could know. Every evening after work, she filled its pages with scenes, observations, and fictional characters inspired by the world around her. It was harmless. Embarrassing perhaps, but harmless. At least that was what she believed until recently. Over the past few months, one character had begun appearing again and again. Tall, reserved, impossible to read. A king burdened by responsibility and isolation. She never used Lucian Blackwood's name. She did not need to. The similarities were obvious enough to make her cheeks warm whenever she thought about them. A sudden knock pulled her from her thoughts. Evelyn nearly spilled her tea. "Miss Hart," a young messenger asked from the doorway. "The Royal Council has requested these records immediately." She accepted the folders and offered a grateful smile. Work. Good. Work was safer than thinking. Several minutes later, she stepped into the main corridor leading toward the administrative wing. Sunlight streamed through towering windows that stretched nearly 20 feet high. Her shoes clicked softly against polished stone. Everything felt normal again. Then she turned a corner and stopped. At the far end of the hallway stood Lucian Blackwood. He was alone. No advisors. No guards. No council members surrounding him. Just the Alpha King reviewing a document near one of the windows. Evelyn's breath caught. There were at least 70 feet between them, yet something inside her immediately became aware of his presence, as though every instinct she possessed had quietly awakened. Before she could retreat, Lucian lifted his head, and once again, his gaze found hers first. For a moment, Evelyn forgot how to breathe. The corridor seemed impossibly quiet despite the distant sounds of palace life echoing somewhere beyond the stone walls. Sunlight spilled through the towering windows and painted pale gold across the floor between them, turning the 70-foot stretch of polished stone into something that felt far longer. Lucian Blackwood lowered the document in his hand. He did not appear surprised to see her. If anything, he looked as though he had expected her to be there. Evelyn immediately dropped her gaze. It was the respectful thing to do, the safe thing to do, yet she could still feel the weight of his attention. Every instinct urged her to keep walking. Deliver the records. Finish her assignment. Pretend this moment had never happened. Her feet, however, seemed determined to betray her. She stood frozen for several seconds before finally forcing herself forward. Each step sounded louder than the last. The folders pressed tightly against her chest. Her pulse refused to settle. Lucian remained where he was near the window, one hand resting loosely at his side. Unlike most rulers, he never surrounded himself with unnecessary displays of authority. He did not need them. His presence alone commanded attention. As Evelyn approached, she noticed details she usually avoided observing. The dark coat tailored perfectly to his broad frame. The silver cuff at his wrist engraved with the royal crest. The faint crease between his brows that suggested exhaustion more than anger. It struck her suddenly that he looked tired. Not weak. Never weak. Simply burdened. The realization unsettled her more than it should have. At 30 feet away, she reminded herself to keep moving. At 20 feet away, she told herself not to look up. At 10 feet away, she failed. Their eyes met again. Silver. That was always the first thing people noticed about Lucian Blackwood. Stories described his eyes as cold, intimidating, impossible to read. Evelyn had repeated those descriptions to herself for years. Yet standing here now, she saw something different. Not coldness, distance. As though part of him remained somewhere far beyond the palace walls no matter where he stood. Miss Hart. The sound of her name nearly made her stumble. She had never heard him say it before. His voice was calm and low, carrying easily through the corridor. Evelyn tightened her grip on the folders. Your Majesty, you work in the Royal Records Office. It was not a question. Yes, sir. Lucian studied her for a second longer than necessary. Not rudely, not intensely, simply attentively, as if committing something to memory. You organize council reports, among other duties. A faint silence followed. Evelyn expected him to dismiss her. Instead, he glanced toward the folders she carried. And what crisis threatens the kingdom today? The question caught her completely off guard. For one stunned second, she wondered if he was serious. Then she realized the corner of his mouth had shifted ever so slightly. Not quite a smile. Something close to one. Mostly inventory reports, sir, she answered carefully. Then perhaps the kingdom will survive another day. Evelyn blinked. By the time she recovered enough to respond, Lucian had already stepped aside, allowing her passage down the corridor. She continued walking, determined not to look back. Yet long after she disappeared around the corner, one thought refused to leave her mind. The Alpha King had known her name. The remainder of the day passed in a blur that Evelyn could not seem to organize no matter how hard she tried. Reports were filed incorrectly. Letters ended up in the wrong folders. Twice she caught herself staring at the same line of text without reading a single word. By late afternoon, even her supervisor noticed. You should go home early, the older woman suggested kindly. You look exhausted. Evelyn almost laughed. Exhausted was not the right word. Distracted felt closer. Unsettled felt closer still. She returned to her small apartment inside the eastern residential wing of the palace shortly after sunset. The room was modest but comfortable. A bookshelf stood beside the window. A small writing desk occupied the corner nearest the fireplace. Soft lamplight painted warm shadows across the walls. Usually the familiar space helped her relax. Tonight it only gave her more room to think. Which was exactly the problem. She changed into a simple cream-colored sweater and sat at her desk. For several minutes, she stared at the locked drawer in front of her. Then she sighed and reached for the key hanging beneath her blouse. The drawer opened with a quiet click. Inside rested the leather-bound notebook. Her notebook. Her secret. Evelyn pulled it free and ran her fingertips across the worn cover. This was the one place where she never had to be careful. The one place where every thought could exist without judgment. She opened to a blank page. The familiar scent of paper and ink settled her nerves almost immediately. Slowly she picked up her pen. At first the words came reluctantly, then faster, easier. She wrote about a fictional kingdom hidden among northern mountains. She wrote about a ruler burdened by responsibility. A king who carried the expectations of thousands while quietly wondering if anyone truly knew him at all. None of it was real. None of it was supposed to be real. Yet as the lines filled the page, the image in her mind became clearer. Silver eyes. Quiet strength. A loneliness carefully concealed behind duty. Evelyn paused. Heat touched her cheeks. This is ridiculous, she whispered to the empty room. She closed the notebook halfway and leaned back in her chair. Outside, rain had begun tapping softly against the window. Somewhere in the distance, palace bells marked the passing hour. Everything should have felt ordinary. Instead, the strange awareness that had followed her all day returned. Not fear, not anxiety, something harder to name. Across the palace, several floors above the sleeping city, Lucian stood alone in his private study. A storm rolled beyond the tall windows overlooking the kingdom. Lightning flashed briefly among distant clouds. Yet his attention remained fixed on the report spread across his desk. Or rather, on the fact that he had reread the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a single sentence. His thoughts kept returning to a quiet woman carrying folders through a corridor, to a nervous smile, to the way her expression changed whenever he spoke directly to her. Lucian exhaled slowly and closed the report. This was unlike him. He did not become distracted. He did not dwell on insignificant encounters. Yet tonight, for reasons he could not explain, he found himself wondering what Evelyn Hart looked like when she was not working. And neither of them realized that this simple question was about to change everything. The next 3 days should have returned everything to normal. Instead, they made the strange tension worse. Evelyn noticed it in small ways at first. A council report that arrived on her desk carrying the Alpha King's personal seal when it could have been delivered through any number of officials. A request for archived records that specifically listed her department rather than a senior administrator. None of it meant anything on its own. Yet together, The incidents formed a pattern she could not ignore. Late Thursday afternoon, she found herself carrying another stack of documents toward the Western Council chambers. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows lining the corridor, turning the outside world into a blur of gray and silver. The palace felt quieter than usual. Most officials had already left for the evening. Evelyn adjusted the folders in her arms and quickened her pace. She was halfway down the hall when a familiar voice stopped her. Miss Hart. Her stomach performed an alarming little twist. Lucian stood near an open doorway, reviewing several papers beneath the warm glow of a wall lamp. Somehow he looked less intimidating outside the throne room, more human, which, unfortunately, made him far more difficult to ignore. Your Majesty. A moment, if you have one. Evelyn stepped closer before reminding herself not to look nervous. The effort failed immediately. Lucian seemed to notice. His expression softened by the smallest fraction. You organize records from every territory in the kingdom. Yes, sir. Then perhaps you can settle a debate. She blinked. A debate? My advisors disagree about which northern settlement receives the heaviest annual snowfall. Evelyn stared for a second before answering. Pine Hollow. Without hesitation. The average is nearly 100 inches each winter. A brief silence followed. Then Lucian nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. Evelyn narrowed her eyes slightly. Your Majesty already knew that. The faintest trace of amusement appeared in his silver gaze. I did. Then why ask? I was curious whether you would answer. Evelyn could not stop the surprised laugh that escaped her. The sound echoed softly through the empty corridor. The moment it happened, both of them seemed to notice. She immediately looked away. Lucian remained unusually still. For reasons she could not explain, the atmosphere shifted. Not dramatically. Not enough for anyone else to recognize. Just enough to make her suddenly aware of every heartbeat. She cleared her throat. Was there anything else, sir? Lucian studied her for a moment. No. Relief and disappointment arrived at exactly the same time. The contradiction annoyed her. She offered a polite nod and continued down the corridor. Halfway to the stairwell, she glanced back despite herself. Lucian was still standing there, watching her leave. Later that evening, seated alone at her desk with the leather notebook open before her, Evelyn stared at a blank page for nearly 10 minutes. Then she finally began to write. Not about a king, not about a palace, not about Silver Eyes. Yet somehow, before she realized what she was doing, every line led back to the same person. And somewhere else inside Blackthorne Palace, Lucian Blackwood found himself wondering what secret thoughts occupied Evelyn Hart whenever she disappeared behind a closed door. Friday arrived wrapped in low clouds and steady rain. The palace windows rattled softly beneath the weather while servants hurried through corridors carrying lanterns to brighten the dim morning halls. Evelyn welcomed the distraction of work. After the previous evening, she had promised herself she would stop overthinking every interaction with Lucian Blackwood. He was the Alpha King. She was a records clerk. The situation was simple. It needed to remain simple. Unfortunately, her imagination refused to cooperate. By mid-morning, she sat surrounded by ledgers and territorial census reports in the royal archives. The room smelled faintly of old paper, polished wood, and ink. Normally, the familiar atmosphere helped her focus. Today, however, she found herself rereading the same paragraph for the third time. A soft knock interrupted her frustration. One of the younger assistants entered carrying several folders. These came directly from the council office, he said. The Alpha King requested expedited processing. Evelyn accepted the stack and thanked him. The moment she saw the royal seal, a strange warmth crept into her cheeks. Ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. She forced herself back to work. Hours later, as afternoon approached, she crossed the palace carrying completed reports toward the executive wing. The rain had finally stopped. Pale sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling overhead, illuminating floating dust particles like tiny stars suspended in the air. Everything seemed peaceful. Then she sensed it again. That awareness. The feeling that someone had entered a room before she even looked up. Lucian stood near a balcony overlooking the inner courtyard. Several advisors were speaking with him, presenting documents and discussing schedules. Yet before Evelyn consciously registered any details, she noticed his gaze shift toward her position. Just briefly, just long enough for her pulse to stumble. She immediately lowered her eyes and continued walking. Across the corridor, Lucian watched her pass. The conversation around him faded into background noise. For nearly a week, he had observed the same pattern. Whenever Evelyn appeared, something changed. Not merely within his thoughts, within his instincts. Her scent carried subtle variations impossible to ignore. Most wolves would never notice them. An Alpha King noticed everything. Especially now. There was nervousness there. Curiosity. Excitement whenever she became absorbed in private thoughts. The changes were faint but unmistakable. What puzzled him was that they seemed strongest after evenings spent away from the palace. As though she carried a secret life hidden behind her quiet routine. Lucian disliked mysteries. Yet this particular mystery had become impossible to dismiss. By sunset, Evelyn finally returned to her apartment. Relief settled over her the moment the door closed behind her. No meetings, no reports, no unexpected encounters. Just silence. She changed into comfortable clothes, lit a small lamp beside her desk, and unlocked the familiar drawer. The leather notebook waited exactly where she had left it. Her shoulders relaxed immediately. This place belonged only to her. Here she could think without caution. Here she could write without fear of judgment. Opening to a blank page, she smiled softly and lowered her pen to paper. Outside, darkness gathered beyond the window. Inside Blackthorne Palace, the Alpha King stood alone in his study, staring at the storm-cleared sky. Neither of them knew it yet, but one secret was becoming harder to hide with every passing day. Saturday arrived with clear skies and crisp spring air sweeping across Blackthorne Palace. For the first time in days, sunlight poured through the towering windows without interruption from rain clouds. Evelyn should have enjoyed it. Instead, she spent most of the morning avoiding places where she might accidentally encounter Lucian. It was becoming a problem. Every unexpected conversation lingered in her thoughts far longer than it should. Every brief glance seemed to follow her throughout the day. By noon, she had relocated to one of the quieter archive rooms beneath the Eastern Library. Few people visited the lower level. The stone walls muffled outside noise, and rows of shelves stretched nearly 40 feet in every direction. It was the perfect place to focus. Or at least it should have been. Evelyn sat cross-legged on a small ladder beside a cart overflowing with records. An open ledger rested in her lap. She was halfway through cataloging shipping manifests when a smile slipped across her face without warning. Her pen paused. She knew exactly why. Last night's notebook entry had turned into nearly 20 pages. 20 pages she absolutely should not have written. 20 pages centered around a fictional king who looked suspiciously familiar. Groaning softly, she covered her eyes with one hand. "You need a new imagination," she muttered to herself. Unfortunately, her imagination seemed quite satisfied with its current direction. Upstairs, meanwhile, Lucian was attempting to conduct palace business. Attempting being the important word. 3 separate advisors had repeated the same question before he finally answered. A trade proposal sat open across his desk. He had not read a single paragraph. Instead, his attention kept returning to an observation that made no logical sense. Evelyn Hart had successfully avoided him all morning. Most people sought opportunities to be noticed by the Alpha King. They positioned themselves strategically during meetings. They lingered after conversations. They volunteered for assignments near the executive wing. Evelyn appeared to be doing the exact opposite. The realization should have amused him. Instead, it made him curious. By late afternoon, curiosity won. Lucian dismissed his final meeting and left his office alone. Palace staff stepped aside as he moved through the corridors, but his destination remained known only to him. Eventually, he found himself standing near the entrance of the Eastern Library. The scent reached him before anything else. Soft, familiar, distinctive enough now that he recognized it instantly. His gaze shifted toward the lower archive staircase. Below, hidden among towering shelves, Evelyn remained completely unaware of his presence. She was writing, not working, not organizing records. Writing. Her expression was different than usual. Relaxed, animated, alive in a way he rarely saw inside formal palace halls. Lucian stopped at the top of the stairs. He did not approach. He did not interrupt. For several quiet moments, he simply watched her smile at whatever existed on the page before her. Then Evelyn suddenly froze. The pen stopped moving. A strange awareness prickled across her skin. Slowly, she looked up from her notebook. Her heartbeat stumbled. At the far end of the staircase, standing motionless beneath a shaft of afternoon sunlight, was the Alpha King. And judging by the look in his silver eyes, he had been there longer than she realized. Time seemed to stop inside the archive room. Evelyn's heart hammered so loudly she was certain he could hear it from 30 feet away. The notebook rested open on her lap. Her hand instinctively moved across the page, as if she could somehow hide every word she had written. Lucian remained at the top of the staircase, one hand resting lightly against the stone railing. He looked completely composed. The problem was that he always looked completely composed. It made it impossible to know what he was thinking. Evelyn rose so quickly that several loose papers slid from the shelf beside her. She caught them before they reached the floor. "Your Majesty." Her voice came out higher than intended. Lucian descended the staircase at an unhurried pace. Each step seemed unfairly calm compared to the chaos unfolding inside her mind. "I did not mean to interrupt." The statement sounded sincere. Somehow that made her more nervous. "You were not interrupting anything important." The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. Her gaze flickered toward the notebook. Lucian followed the movement. Only briefly, but he noticed. Of course he noticed. The Alpha King seemed to notice everything. "A personal project?" he asked. Evelyn tightened her grip around the leather cover. "Just writing. You enjoy it." It was not a question. She hesitated. "Sometimes." A faint smile touched his expression. "You smile differently when you are writing." The observation struck her with surprising force. Nobody had ever said something like that before. Most people barely noticed her at all. Yet somehow Lucian had noticed the difference between her professional smile and her genuine one. The realization left her speechless. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable exactly. Simply unfamiliar. Sunlight streamed through the high library windows, casting long golden beams across rows of shelves. Dust drifted lazily through the air. Somewhere above them, a clock chimed the hour. Lucian's attention remained fixed on her. "You spend a great deal of time in this room. It is quiet. And you prefer quiet places." Evelyn looked down at the notebook again. Usually, for reasons she could not explain, the answer seemed to amuse him. Lucian glanced around the archive. "When I was younger, I used to hide in libraries." Her eyes widened. "You did?" "Frequently. I cannot imagine anyone forcing the Alpha King to hide." The moment she said it, she realized how bold the comment sounded. To her surprise, Lucian laughed softly. The sound was warm and unexpectedly genuine. "You would be surprised." Evelyn stared at him. For the first time since meeting him, he did not seem like a distant ruler seated upon a throne. He seemed like a man carrying memories nobody else knew. The thought lingered longer than it should have. Then footsteps echoed somewhere above. The spell shattered instantly. Lucian straightened. The familiar reserve returned to his posture. "I should allow you to continue your work." Evelyn nodded. "Yes, sir." He turned toward the stairs before pausing halfway up. Without looking back, he said, "I hope your story is going well, Miss Hart." Then he disappeared beyond the upper level. Evelyn remained frozen among the shelves long after he left. Slowly, she looked down at the notebook pressed against her chest. The problem was no longer that Lucian Blackwood had noticed her. The problem was that she was beginning to wonder if she wanted him to. The week that followed should have made things easier. Instead, it made everything more complicated. Evelyn found herself noticing Lucian everywhere. Not because he appeared more often, but because her attention searched for him before she realized it was happening. A glimpse of dark fabric turning a corner. A familiar voice drifting from a meeting room. The distant sound of footsteps in a corridor. Each small detail seemed to linger longer than it should. She told herself it was harmless. She told herself she simply admired him as a ruler. The explanation sounded reasonable until she opened her notebook each night. Then every carefully constructed excuse fell apart. Sunday evening arrived wrapped in golden light. The palace gardens glowed beneath the setting sun, and a warm breeze carried the scent of blooming roses through open windows. Evelyn sat beside her desk with the notebook resting on her knees. The page before her remained blank. For once, she was afraid to write. Not because of the stories themselves. Because they were becoming too honest. The fictional king she had created no longer resembled a distant character. He laughed the way Lucian laughed. He carried responsibilities the way Lucian carried them. He stood alone at windows and stared across kingdoms exactly the way she imagined Lucian did. Every chapter brought the resemblance closer. Eventually, she closed the notebook with a frustrated sigh. Across Blackthorne Palace, Lucian stood inside a council chamber overlooking the western cliffs. Advisors discussed preparations for an upcoming diplomatic gathering scheduled later that month. Representatives from neighboring territories would soon arrive. Alliances would be strengthened. Agreements negotiated. It was important work. Yet his thoughts drifted elsewhere. "Your Majesty?" one advisor asked carefully. Lucian blinked. "Continue." The meeting resumed, but his focus remained divided. Over the past several days, he had learned something unusual about Evelyn Hart. The more attention he gave her, the harder she tried to avoid receiving it. Most people sought proximity to power. Evelyn seemed determined to maintain distance. Yet every time she believed nobody was watching, small glimpses of her true self appeared. A quiet laugh, a thoughtful smile, a spark of humor hidden beneath professional politeness. Those moments intrigued him far more than they should have. Later that evening, after the final meeting concluded, Lucian crossed the palace alone. As he passed through one of the eastern corridors, movement caught his attention. Ahead, nearly 50 feet away, Evelyn emerged from a side stairwell, carrying several books against her chest. She did not notice him immediately. Her attention remained fixed on her own thoughts. Then something unexpected happened. She smiled. Not at anyone. Not because someone spoke to her. Just a private smile meant for herself alone. Lucian slowed. The expression lasted only a second before she realized he was there. Instantly, the smile disappeared. Evelyn stopped walking. Embarrassment flashed across her features. Lucian found himself unexpectedly disappointed. "Good evening, Miss Hart." "Your Majesty. You seem happy tonight." The observation made her cheeks turn pink. "I was thinking about something." "A good something?" She hesitated before answering. "I think so." Lucian nodded once. For reasons neither of them understood, the simple exchange felt more personal than many conversations lasting hours. Then Evelyn continued down the corridor and disappeared around a corner. Lucian remained where he was. And for the first time, he found himself wondering whether the secret occupying Evelyn's thoughts might somehow involve him. Monday morning brought a different energy to Blackthorne Palace. Servants moved more quickly through the halls. Advisors carried overflowing folders. Preparations for the upcoming diplomatic gathering had officially begun, and every department felt the pressure. Evelyn welcomed the extra work. Busy schedules left less time for unnecessary thoughts. Unfortunately, they did not eliminate them entirely. By mid-morning, she sat inside the Central Records office surrounded by maps, guest registries, and seating arrangements. Representatives from more than a dozen territories would soon arrive. Every detail required careful organization. She had spent nearly 3 hours reviewing assignments when another folder appeared on her desk. The royal seal stamped across the front immediately caught her attention. Evelyn opened it carefully. Her eyes widened. The document contained a request for administrative assistance during the diplomatic event. Specifically, assistance assigned directly to the Alpha King's office. She stared at the page. Then she checked the name listed at the bottom. Hers. "No," she whispered. Across the room, several co-workers were already discussing their own assignments. None of them seemed surprised. Evelyn, however, felt her pulse quicken. Working near Lucian occasionally was one thing. Spending several days assisting his office directly was something entirely different. Before she could convince herself it was a clerical error, another message arrived requesting her presence in the executive wing at noon. The next 2 hours passed far too quickly. By the time the palace clock struck 12, she found herself standing outside a familiar set of carved oak doors. Taking a steadying breath, she knocked. "Enter." Lucian's voice carried clearly from inside. Evelyn stepped into the office. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the capital city below. Shelves lined the walls. Maps covered one side of the room. Behind an enormous desk sat the Alpha King himself. He looked up immediately. For reasons she could never explain, his attention always seemed to find her the moment she entered a room. "Miss Hart." "Your Majesty." Lucian motioned toward the chair opposite his desk. "Please sit." Evelyn obeyed, setting her notebook of work materials carefully on her lap. Lucian reviewed several documents before speaking. "You have likely seen the assignment request." "Yes, sir." "Do you object to it?" The question caught her completely off guard. "Object?" You appeared concerned. Heat rushed to her cheeks. I was surprised. A faint smile touched his expression. "Not concerned." Evelyn hesitated. perhaps a little concerned. To her surprise, Lucian laughed softly. The sound instantly eased some of the tension in the room. That is fair. Silence settled briefly between them. Then Lucian leaned back slightly in his chair. The event will require someone organized, dependable, and capable of managing details others overlook. Evelyn blinked. There are many people qualified for that. Perhaps. His silver eyes met hers steadily. But I requested you. The words landed with unexpected weight. For one suspended moment, neither of them looked away. Then a knock interrupted the silence. An advisor entered carrying several reports. The moment vanished. Yet as Evelyn gathered her papers and prepared to leave, one realization followed her into the corridor. This assignment had not happened by accident. Lucian Blackwood had chosen her. For the rest of the afternoon, Evelyn could not concentrate. Every time she opened a report, the same sentence echoed through her thoughts. I requested you. The words should not have mattered. There were countless practical reasons Lucian could have selected her. She was organized, reliable, familiar with palace operations. Yet none of those explanations fully quieted the strange flutter that appeared whenever she remembered the way he had said it. By the following evening, preparations for the diplomatic gathering had transformed the palace into a whirlwind of activity. Staff hurried through corridors carrying schedules and seating charts. Fresh flowers arrived by the hundreds. Guest suites were inspected repeatedly. Evelyn spent most of the day coordinating details from a temporary workspace just outside the Alpha King's office. The arrangement meant she saw Lucian far more often than usual. It also meant she became increasingly aware of small things she had never noticed before. He thanked servants by name. He listened carefully when others spoke. He carried the weight of endless responsibilities without complaining. The realization unsettled her. It was much easier to admire a distant king than a real person. Late that afternoon, a delegation from the Southern Territories arrived earlier than expected. The palace immediately shifted into controlled chaos. Advisors moved in every direction at once. Messages arrived faster than they could be processed. Evelyn sat at a long table reviewing guest assignments when a shadow fell across the papers. Miss Hart. She looked up. A man stood before her wearing an elegant navy coat marked with the crest of the Southern Coast Pack. He appeared to be around 30 years old, confident and friendly. I am Ethan Caldwell, he said with a smile. I was told you are the only person in this palace capable of making sense of these schedules. Evelyn laughed despite herself. I'm not sure that is true. Then someone has greatly exaggerated your talents. That seems more likely. Ethan smiled again, and soon they were discussing accommodations and event logistics. The conversation remained entirely professional, yet surprisingly easy. For the first time all day, Evelyn relaxed. Several feet away, Lucian emerged from a meeting room with two senior advisors. His attention immediately swept across the corridor. It found Evelyn without effort. Then he noticed something else. She was laughing. Not politely. Not formally. Genuinely. The Southern delegate was standing beside her, speaking animatedly while she smiled at something he had said. Lucian slowed almost imperceptibly. One of his advisors continued discussing diplomatic concerns, but the words seemed oddly distant. His gaze remained fixed on the scene ahead. Ethan leaned slightly closer to point at a document. Evelyn nodded, still smiling. Nothing about the interaction was inappropriate. Nothing about it should have mattered. Yet a strange irritation settled beneath Lucian's calm exterior. He did not like it. More troubling, he could not explain why. Across the corridor, Evelyn glanced up and immediately noticed him. The smile faded from her face. Not because she was unhappy to see him, because suddenly she felt aware of everything at once. Ethan followed her gaze toward the Alpha King. Lucian's silver eyes met hers from nearly 40 feet away. The corridor seemed to quiet around them. Then Ethan spoke a single sentence that neither of them expected. You know, he said casually, I do not think the Alpha King likes sharing your attention. The words lingered in the air long after Ethan spoke them. Evelyn stared at him, convinced she had misheard. That is not true, she said quickly. Ethan lifted both hands in surrender. Perhaps not. I only said what it looked like from where I was standing. Before she could respond, another palace attendant approached with questions regarding guest accommodations, pulling Ethan into a separate conversation. The interruption should have been a relief. Instead, it left Evelyn alone with a thought she could not dismiss. She risked another glance toward the far end of the corridor. Lucian was gone. The absence unsettled her more than his presence ever had. The diplomatic gathering officially began that evening. Hundreds of guests filled the grand hall beneath glittering chandeliers and banners representing territories from across the kingdom. Music drifted softly through the room, while conversations blended into a constant hum of voices. Evelyn moved carefully between tables carrying schedules, updates, and last-minute requests. It felt as though the entire palace was balancing on a single thread of organization. Somehow, despite the chaos, everything continued moving forward. Nearly 2 hours into the event, she finally paused near one of the tall windows overlooking the city. Beyond the glass, thousands of lights shimmered against the darkness like scattered stars. For the first time all evening, she allowed herself a slow breath. Enjoying the view? The familiar voice behind her sent a jolt through her chest. Evelyn turned. Lucian stood only a few feet away. Unlike earlier, there were no advisors surrounding him. No delegates demanding attention. For one rare moment, he appeared completely alone. "Your Majesty, you have been working nonstop. So have you." A faint smile appeared in his eyes. "That is different." Evelyn looked away before she could overthink the exchange. The city lights reflected softly across the window between them. For several seconds neither spoke. Surprisingly, the silence felt comfortable. Then Lucian's expression shifted. Not dramatically, just enough for her to notice. His attention moved briefly toward the center of the ballroom, where Ethan Caldwell was laughing with several diplomats. When Lucian looked back at her, something thoughtful lingered behind his silver gaze. "The Southern delegate seems to enjoy your company." Evelyn nearly choked on her own breath. Ethan, the fact that she immediately used the man's first name did not help her situation. Lucian raised one eyebrow. "Ethan." Heat flooded her cheeks. "We have only been discussing event logistics." "Of course." His tone remained perfectly calm. That somehow made it worse. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "Was that skepticism?" "I would never question your professional judgment, Miss Hart." She stared at him. To her astonishment, Lucian looked dangerously close to amused. A laugh escaped before she could stop it. The sound seemed to catch both of them by surprise. For a brief moment, the crowded ballroom disappeared. There were no delegates, no responsibilities, no titles. Only two people sharing an unexpectedly easy conversation beside a window. Then music swelled across the hall, and someone called for the Alpha King from the opposite side of the room. Reality returned. Lucian glanced toward the waiting officials before looking back at her. "Duty calls." Evelyn nodded. "It usually does." He held her gaze for 1 second longer than necessary. "We will continue this conversation later." Then he turned and walked away. Evelyn watched him disappear into the crowd. And for the first time, she realized she was already looking forward to later. The diplomatic gathering continued well past midnight, but Evelyn barely noticed the passing hours. She moved through the grand hall completing assignments, answering questions, and coordinating schedules, yet a small part of her attention remained fixed on a single promise. "We will continue this conversation later." The words replayed endlessly in her thoughts. By the time the final delegates began retiring to their guest suites, the palace had grown quieter. Music faded. Conversations thinned. One by one, the chandeliers were dimmed until only a warm golden glow remained across the enormous hall. Evelyn gathered the last of her paperwork and finally allowed herself to exhale. The event had been a success. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt strangely restless. As she crossed the corridor leading toward the eastern wing, she noticed a familiar figure standing beside one of the tall balcony doors. Lucian. Moonlight spilled across the marble floor beyond him. For a moment she considered continuing past without interrupting. Then he turned. The instant their eyes met, she knew he had been waiting. "Miss Hart." His voice carried the same calm warmth she had begun recognizing immediately. "Your Majesty." Lucian glanced toward the open balcony. "Walk with me." It was not a command. It felt more like an invitation. Evelyn followed him outside. Cool night air drifted across the balcony overlooking the sleeping capital. Thousands of lights stretched toward the horizon. Above them, stars glittered against a clear sky. For several moments neither spoke. Surprisingly, the silence felt natural. Lucian rested one hand against the stone railing. "You handled today exceptionally well." Evelyn smiled softly. "I had excellent instructions." "You had impossible instructions." The corner of her mouth lifted. "That too." A quiet laugh escaped him. The sound seemed brighter beneath the night sky. Then his expression grew thoughtful. You never seek attention. Evelyn blinked at the unexpected observation. I am not sure what to do with attention once I have it. Most people spend their lives chasing it. She looked out over the city lights. Most people are probably smarter than I am. Lucian shook his head. No, they simply do not understand the value of being genuine. The words settled between them. Evelyn felt her heartbeat quicken. There was nothing improper about the conversation. Nothing dramatic. Yet it felt more honest than anything they had shared before. Slowly she turned toward him. Lucian was already looking at her. Not as a king reviewing an employee. Not as a ruler addressing a subject. Simply as a man paying careful attention to someone who mattered. Neither of them looked away. The city lights shimmered below. A cool breeze moved through the night. Somewhere deep inside, Evelyn realized she was no longer afraid of being noticed. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Lucian Blackwood found himself wanting something that had nothing to do with power, politics, or duty. Neither of them knew where the path ahead would lead. But as they stood together beneath the stars, one truth became impossible to ignore. The story Evelyn had spent so long hiding was only beginning, and neither of them yet realized that the next secret waiting to be uncovered would change everything.